On the 10th of June, 323 years before Christ, in the sweltering heart of Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Babylon, a 32-year-old man lay dying of fever. His generals filed past his bed one by one. He could no longer speak. When they asked to whom he left the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the ancient sources say he whispered a single word: to the strongest. His name was Alexander, and by the time his heart stopped beating, he had marched over 20,000 miles, shattered the oldest empire on earth, founded more than 20 cities, and dragged the Greek world kicking and screaming into Asia. He was younger than most people reading for a graduate degree. How does a single human life burn that bright, reshape that much of the known world, and then vanish in a Babylonian fever ward before the age of 33? This is his complete story. Not a highlight reel, not a greatest battles compilation. This is the entire life, told from the beginning, lived from the inside. You will walk the marble corridors of Pella, where a boy was born to a father who had already conquered Greece, and a mother who claimed the blood of Achilles ran in her veins. You will sit in the gardens of Mieza, where Aristotle himself taught that boy to think, to question, to read Homer until the words became a second heartbeat. You will stand on the field at Chaeronea, where a 16-year-old prince led the companion cavalry into the sacred band of Thebes and broke them forever. You will witness a father's assassination in a crowded theatre, and the ruthless speed with which a 20-year-old seized a throne encircled by enemies who wanted him dead. Then the world opens. You will cross the Hellespont into Asia, feel the cold water of the Granicus beneath hooves, watch Darius III flee his own chariot at Issus. You will endure 7 months of siege at Tyre, walk into Egypt as a liberator, and hear the oracle at Siwa proclaim a mortal man the son of a god. You will see the dust of Gaugamela, where 200,000 Persian soldiers could not stop one cavalry wedge aimed at the heart of an empire. You will smell the smoke when Persepolis burns. But this is also the story of what conquest costs. You will see a man who loved Homer murder his closest friend Cleitus at a banquet table, then weep over the body until dawn. You will watch his veterans, men who followed him across the known world, finally refuse to march one step further into the monsoon rains of India. You will cross the nightmare desert of Gedrosia, where more of his soldiers died of thirst and heat than fell in any battle. You will feel the grief that shattered him when Hephaestion, the person he loved most in the world, died in his arms at Ecbatana. What makes Alexander impossible to look away from is the contradiction. He was a philosopher's student who set fire to palaces, a Macedonian king who dressed in Persian robes and demanded his free Greek companions bow to him like subjects. A tactical genius who risked his own life in every cavalry charge as if daring the gods to stop him. A visionary who dreamed of fusing East and West into a single civilization, and a drunk who could not control his own rage. Every century since his death has tried to claim him. Greeks, Romans, Persians, medieval Christians, modern generals, they all see their own reflection in him. The Alexander romance turned him into a myth that circled the globe. But beneath the legend, the archaeological evidence, the coins bearing his profile, the city grids he laid out, the fragments of eyewitness accounts from Ptolemy and Aristobulus and Nearchus, these reveal something more extraordinary than any myth. A real human being whose ambition literally redrew the map of the ancient world and whose death at 32 left a vacuum so vast it took a generation of wars among his own generals to fill it. If you value complete journeys through the lives that shaped civilization, subscribe and stay close. Each week, we bring back one immortal name, not as legend tells it, but as the evidence demands, the real human being behind the undying story. Now let us begin where all of it began, in a kingdom coiling itself for war, in a palace where a queen held a newborn son and believed he was destined for something the world had never seen. This is where the legend starts, with a child no one yet feared. In the summer of 356 years before the Common Era, in the ancient palace at Pella, a boy was born who would reshape the known world before his 33rd year. The kingdom he entered was not the Greece of marble philosophers and democratic assemblies. Macedon was something older, rougher, a land of mountain timber and river plains, of horse-breeding aristocrats and blood feuds settled with iron. Its capital sat on the edge of a shallow lake, a sprawling complex of colonnaded courtyards and painted halls where mosaics depicted the royal hunt in pebbles of river stone. Here, among the smell of cedar beams and sacrificial smoke, the dynasty of the Argeads held power through force, cunning, and an unbroken claim of descent from Heracles himself. His father was Philip II, a man who had seized the Macedonian throne at 23, and in barely 2 decades transformed a kingdom perpetually raided by its neighbors into the supreme military power north of the Peloponnese. Philip had invented nothing less than a new way of war. His infantry carried the sarissa, a pike of cornel wood stretching nearly 18 feet, and fought in a formation so dense and so deep that no opposing line could withstand its advance. He bound the Highland barons to his court through a system of royal pages and companion cavalry, turning potential rebels into loyal officers. By the year of his son's birth, Philip had already crushed the Illyrians to the west, subdued the Thracians to the east, and begun reaching southward toward the fractious city-states of Greece. His mother was Olympias, princess of the Molossian royal house in Epirus, a woman of formidable will who traced her lineage to Achilles through Neoptolemus. Ancient sources describe her devotion to ecstatic religious rites, the handling of serpents sacred to Dionysus, torchlit processions through mountain forests. Whether these accounts reflect reality or the anxieties of later male chroniclers, Olympias emerges from the record as a figure of fierce intelligence and political instinct, utterly devoted to her son's destiny. Between these two parents, the calculating soldier king and the mystical queen, the child grew in a court where assassination was never distant. Philip had multiple wives, each marriage a diplomatic alliance that also produced rival heirs. The palace corridors of Pella held whispered factions, and every prince who survived childhood did so because someone powerful ensured it. Legend later claimed that on the night of the boy's birth, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground, one of the 7 wonders of the world consumed by flame, while the goddess herself was absent, attending the birth of a future conqueror. The story is almost certainly invention, shaped by hindsight. Yet it reveals how completely later generations believed this life was marked from its first breath. What the sources do confirm is more grounded and no less remarkable. Philip received 3 messages on the same day, according to Plutarch. His general Parmenion had defeated the Illyrians, his racehorse had won at the Olympic Games, and his wife had borne him a son. The king reportedly said that a child born amid such fortune would be unconquerable. The word in Greek was aniketos. The Macedon this child inherited was no backwater dreaming of past glory. It was a state coiled for expansion, its treasury filling with gold from the mines of Mount Pangaion, its army drilling ceaselessly on the plains below Pella. The world beyond was ripe, Persia vast but aging under Artaxerxes III, the Greek cities exhausted by decades of war among themselves, Egypt restive under foreign rule. The stage was being built before the actor drew his first breath. And in the palace at Pella, beneath painted ceilings where gods feasted in pigment and gold leaf, a dynasty's ambition now had a name. That name was Alexander, and for the first years of his life, the boy moved through a world of soldiers and ceremony, absorbing the rhythms of a court where power was earned in blood. But Philip, for all his martial genius, understood that conquest required more than spears. A king must think, a king must persuade, a king must see the architecture of the world beneath its surface. And so, when the prince reached 13, his father made a decision that would echo through millennia. In 343 before the Common Era, Philip summoned Aristotle of Stagira to Macedon. The philosopher was not yet the towering figure later ages would revere. He was 41, a former student of Plato's academy, brilliant but politically displaced. His home city of Stagira had been razed by Philip's own armies years earlier. The king offered restoration, rebuild Stagira, free its enslaved citizens, and in return, shape the mind of the heir. It was a transaction worthy of both men, knowledge exchanged for power, philosophy yoked to empire. The school was established at Mieza, a quiet royal estate in the foothills west of Pella, where limestone colonnades opened onto gardens shaded by plane trees and watered by cool streams. Here, removed from the intrigues of court, Alexander studied alongside a small circle of noble companions, Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander, Marsyas, boys who would one day become his generals, his governors, his rivals. The setting was deliberately pastoral, modelled perhaps on the groves of the academy itself, a place where thought could breathe. What Aristotle taught remains partially recoverable from later sources. Plutarch tells us the curriculum encompassed medicine, philosophy, rhetoric, and the natural sciences. Alexander reportedly learned enough of healing to treat his companions' wounds on campaign and to argue with physicians about remedies. He studied ethics, the nature of kingship, the structure of constitutions. Aristotle may have prepared for him a special edition of Homer's Iliad, the so-called casket copy, which Alexander would carry throughout his campaigns, sleeping with it beneath his pillow beside a dagger. Whether this detail is fact or later embellishment, it captures something essential. The boy found in Achilles not merely a hero, but a mirror. Homer saturated his imagination. The Iliad offered a world where glory was the highest good, where a short life blazing with achievement surpassed a long one lived in obscurity. Achilles chose fame over years. Alexander, according to every ancient source, internalized this choice completely. It became the engine of his ambition, not wealth, not comfort, but undying renown. Aristotle gave him the intellectual tools to pursue that ambition with precision, but the fire itself came from older, deeper sources, from Olympius whispering of divine ancestry, from Homer singing of Troy. Yet the education was not purely literary. At Mieza the boys trained physically, riding, hunting, wrestling. Macedonian aristocratic culture demanded bodily excellence. Alexander became a superb horseman. The story of Bucephalus, the great black stallion no one else could ride, likely belongs to these years or shortly before. He hunted lions and boars in the royal game parks, building the reflexes and courage that would later carry him into cavalry charges against Persian lines. By 340 before the Common Era, the formal schooling ended. Alexander was 16, and the world would no longer wait. Philip, preparing for campaign against Byzantium, appointed his son regent of Macedon, a staggering responsibility for a youth barely past boyhood. The gardens of Mieza receded behind him like a dream of stillness before the storm. But what Aristotle had planted would never leave: the hunger to know, the conviction that a king must embody both thought and action, and the ghost of Achilles walking always at his shoulder, whispering that glory was worth any price. The regency proved brief, but decisive. While Philip besieged Byzantium far to the east, his 16-year-old son governed Macedon alone, and when the Maedi, a Thracian tribe along the northern frontier, rose in revolt, Alexander marched against them without waiting for his father's permission. He crushed the uprising, seized their chief settlement, and refounded it as Alexandropolis, naming it after himself in deliberate imitation of his father's Philippopolis. It was a statement. The boy intended to be remembered. But the true test came 2 years later, in the late summer of 338 before the Common Era, on a plain in Boeotia, where the fate of Greece would be decided in a single afternoon. Philip had spent years tightening his grip on the Greek world through diplomacy, bribery, and selective violence. Now Athens and Thebes, ancient rivals driven together by desperation, assembled a coalition army and marched north to block the pass at Chaeronea. Their combined force numbered perhaps 35,000, hoplites hardened by generations of warfare, anchored on their left by the legendary sacred band of Thebes, 300 paired warriors who had never known defeat in open battle. Philip brought roughly the same numbers but a different kind of army. The Macedonian phalanx with its forest of sarissas, each pike nearly 18 feet long, and on the flanks the companion cavalry, the finest mounted shock force in the Greek world. Command of the left wing, facing the sacred band directly, he entrusted to Alexander. The boy was 18 years old. Dawn light catches the bronze of thousands of helmets across the Cephissus plain. Dust rises from the tramping of feet as the phalanx battalions dress their lines. On the Macedonian left, Alexander sits astride his horse among the companions, watching the Theban formation opposite. Shields locked, spears leveled, the sacred band holding their ground with the discipline of men who have trained together since youth. Philip opened the battle with a calculated withdrawal on the right, drawing the Athenian hoplites forward and stretching the allied line until gaps appeared. The moment came. Alexander saw the seam open between the Theban contingent and their neighbors, and he drove the companion cavalry into it like a blade into flesh. The charge was devastating. The companions struck at the gallop, lances couched, shattering the cohesion of the allied center. Then Alexander wheeled and fell upon the sacred band from flank and rear. What followed was not a rout, but an annihilation. The 300 fought where they stood, refusing to break, refusing to surrender. They died almost to a man, their bodies found later in ranks, some still locked together. The stone lion erected over their grave at Chaeronea stands to this day. the allied army collapsed. Athens and Thebes sued for peace. Philip, magnanimous in victory, offered generous terms to Athens while garrisoning Thebes. Within months he convened the League of Corinth, binding every major Greek state except Sparta into an alliance under Macedonian leadership, with a single declared purpose: war against Persia. For Alexander, Chaironea was a transformation. He had proven himself not merely competent, but brilliant under the pressure of real battle, leading the decisive blow that broke the finest infantry in Greece. The veterans who rode with him that day would follow him to the ends of the earth. His father recognized it, and perhaps feared it. The ancient sources note a growing tension between them in the months that followed, as Philip took a new wife and Alexander's position as heir seemed momentarily uncertain. But the world had seen what the boy could do when given cavalry and a clear enemy. The sacred band lay beneath Boeotian earth, and Alexander rode home to Pella with blood on his cloak, and a reputation that no one in Macedon could any longer dismiss. He was 18, he had broken the unbreakable, and the road to Asia was opening before him like a door swung wide by the dead. The door swung wide, but not as anyone expected. In the autumn of 336 before the Common Era, at the ancient royal seat of Aegae, Philip II prepared to celebrate the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus. The theatre filled at dawn, ambassadors from every Greek state, Macedonian nobles in their finest cloaks, soldiers who had marched with Philip from the days when Macedon was nothing. Statues of the 12 Olympian gods were carried in procession, and among them a 13th, Philip himself, rendered in gold, placed alongside the immortals. It was the summit of his power, the announcement to all Greece that one man had united the peninsula and would soon lead it against Persia. Philip entered the theatre without his bodyguard, walking between his son Alexander and his new son-in-law, a gesture of confidence and royal theatre. In that open space, a young man named Pausanias, a member of the royal bodyguard, nursing a grievance the sources describe variously as personal humiliation, sexual violation, and denied justice, stepped forward and drove a Celtic blade beneath Philip's ribs. The king fell on the stone seats of his own theatre. He was dead before anyone could reach him. The assassin ran toward waiting horses at the city gate. He was caught, killed by pursuing companions before he could speak. Whether Pausanias acted alone or was the instrument of a larger conspiracy remains one of antiquity's enduring questions. Olympias and Alexander both fell under suspicion in later accounts, though no ancient source proves their involvement. What is certain is that Alexander moved with extraordinary speed in the hours that followed. He was 20 years old. The army knew him from Chaironea. Antipater and Parmenion, Philip's most powerful generals, declared for him immediately, perhaps by prior arrangement. Within days, Alexander secured the assembly's acclamation as king. Then the killing began. Attalus, uncle of Philip's last wife and a potential rallying point for opposition, was murdered in Asia Minor on Alexander's orders. Amyntas, a cousin with a rival claim to the throne, was executed. Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's young bride, and her infant daughter perished. Ancient sources attribute this to Olympias, acting with or without her son's knowledge. The royal house was pruned with surgical brutality until no alternative claimant remained breathing. The Greek world watched and calculated. Thebes, Athens, and other cities that had chafed under Philip's League of Corinth saw opportunity in the young king's inexperience. Alexander marched south with terrifying speed, appearing before Thessaly before the passes could be blocked, receiving their submission, then pressing on to Corinth, where the League confirmed him as hegemon in his father's place. He returned north to campaign against Thracian and Illyrian tribes, threatening Macedon's borders, disappearing into the mountains for months. Thebes chose that moment to revolt, encouraged by a false rumor that Alexander had died in Illyria. The city expelled its Macedonian garrison and called on Greece to rise. Alexander force-marched his army south, 300 miles in 13 days, a pace that seemed impossible. He appeared before Theban walls like a ghost. The city was given a chance to surrender. It refused. What followed was deliberate and devastating. In the autumn of 335, Macedonian forces stormed Thebes. 6,000 Thebans died in the fighting. The survivors, 30,000 men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. The city itself was razed to its foundations, with only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar left standing. Alexander submitted the decision to his Greek allies, who voted for destruction, but no one doubted whose will drove the sentence. It was a message written in ash and silence. Rebellion against Macedon meant annihilation. Athens sent envoys begging pardon. Every city in Greece submitted. Alexander, barely 21, stood where his father had stood, but with a reputation now forged in terror as much as in victory. The throne was his, bought with blood and speed, and the willingness to destroy utterly what would not bend. Behind him lay the bones of rivals and a burned city. Before him lay the Hellespont, and beyond it the whole of Persia. In the spring of 334 before the Common Era, Alexander led his army east from Pella, over 30,000 infantry and more than 5,000 cavalry, the finest fighting force the Greek world had ever assembled. They marched through Thrace and down toward the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia. At the Hellespont, the crossing began on a fleet of 160 triremes and transport vessels, the army ferrying across in waves while Alexander himself steered his flagship toward the Asian shore. He did not step onto the continent quietly. According to the ancient sources, he hurled a spear into the beach sand as his ship approached, claiming Asia as territory won by the spear. Then he went to Troy. He walked among the ruins of Ilium, sacrificed at the temple of Athena, and laid a wreath at what was believed to be the tomb of Achilles. Hephaestion, his closest companion, honored the grave of Patroclus nearby. The gesture was deliberate. Alexander was announcing himself as a new Achilles, come to wage a war worthy of Homer. The Persian satraps of Western Asia Minor did not wait for him to advance deep into their territory. They gathered their forces, perhaps 20,000 cavalry and a comparable number of Greek mercenary infantry, along the eastern bank of the river Granicus, modern Bigaçaya in northwestern Turkey. The position was strong. The river ran swift with spring melt, its far bank steep and muddy, offering defenders the advantage of height and momentum against any crossing force. Alexander's senior general Parmenion reportedly urged caution, to camp, rest, and attempt the crossing at dawn when the Persians might be less prepared. Alexander refused. In the late afternoon light, with the sun behind his army, he ordered the attack. A diversionary force struck first on the left, drawing Persian cavalry toward that flank. Then Alexander himself, conspicuous in white-plumed helmet and burnished armor, led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly into the river on the right. The crossing was brutal. Horses stumbled on river stones. Macedonian riders climbed the slippery bank under a rain of javelins. The Persian cavalry met them at the water's edge, and for long minutes the fighting was hand to hand, lance against lance, sword against sword. Alexander plunged into the thickest press. His sarissa shattered. He called for another. A Persian noble struck his helmet, shearing off one of its plumes. A second blow was descending when Cleitus, called the Black, severed the attacker's arm with a single stroke, saving the king's life. The companion cavalry held, then pushed forward. As more Macedonians gained the bank, the Persian line buckled. Their cavalry broke and fled. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service, perhaps 6,000 men, formed a defensive square on a nearby hill and asked for terms. Alexander refused. He sent his phalanx against them frontally while cavalry struck their flanks. The slaughter was methodical. Only 2,000 survived to be sent in chains to forced labor in Macedon. It was a statement. Greeks who fought for Persia could expect no mercy. The victory at the Granicus shattered Persian authority in Western Asia Minor overnight. City after city opened its gates. Alexander moved south along the Aegean coast, liberating the old Greek cities of Ionia from Persian-appointed tyrants and oligarchs. At Sardis, the great fortress surrendered without a fight. At Ephesus, the populace overthrew their garrison before he arrived. He restored democratic governments, remitted tribute formerly paid to Persia, and dedicated it instead to local temples. The gesture was political genius. He came not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, fulfilling the stated purpose of the League of Corinth's war. He sent 300 captured Persian panoplies back to Athens, dedicated to Athena with an inscription that read, "From Alexander and the Greeks, except the Spartans," a pointed reminder that Sparta alone had refused to join his alliance. Already, barely months into Asia, the young king was managing propaganda as skillfully as battle. The road south lay open. Miletus and Halicarnassus would resist, but the pattern was set. Persia's western provinces were falling like tiles from a crumbling mosaic, and somewhere beyond the Taurus Mountains, the great King Darius III was only beginning to understand what had crossed into his empire. The winter of 334 gave way to a spring of movement. Alexander swept south along the Anatolian coast, reducing Miletus by siege and disbanding most of his own fleet, a gamble that forced the war onto land, where Macedonian arms held every advantage. Halicarnassus fell after bitter fighting, its Persian garrison withdrawing by sea while the city burned behind them. Then the king turned inland, climbing through Lycia and Pamphylia into the heart of Anatolia, where an ancient prophecy waited. Gaudium sat on the old royal road, the former capital of Phrygia. In its citadel stood an ox cart dedicated centuries earlier by the legendary King Midas, its yoke lashed to a pole by a knot of cornel bark so intricately wound that no end was visible. Tradition held that whoever loosed the knot would rule all Asia. The sources disagree on what happened next. Aristobulus claimed Alexander simply pulled the pin from the yoke pole, bypassing the knot entirely. Others, Plutarch among them, say he drew his sword and cut it. What matters is the result. The army believed the prophecy fulfilled. Their king would rule Asia. From Gaudium the march continued east through Cappadocia and into Cilicia, descending through the narrow pass called the Cilician Gates, a defile so tight that a handful of defenders might have held it indefinitely. But the Persian garrison fled at Alexander's approach, and the army poured through into the coastal plain around Tarsus. Here Alexander fell dangerously ill, likely from plunging overheated into the icy Cydnus River. For days the campaign hung suspended while physicians debated treatment. He recovered, but the delay proved consequential. Darius III had not been idle. The great king had gathered an enormous host. Ancient sources claim 600,000, though modern estimates suggest perhaps 100,000, and marched west from Babylon. Rather than wait on the open Syrian plain, where his numbers might have enveloped the Macedonians, Darius made a fateful choice. He swung north behind Alexander's army, cutting its supply line and occupying the town of Issus, where he mutilated the Macedonian sick left behind. When Alexander learned that the Persian king stood in his rear, he turned his army around and marched back north through the night. On a narrow coastal plain near the Pinarus River, in November of 333 before the Common Era, the two kings faced each other for the first time. The battlefield was barely 2.5 miles wide, hemmed between mountains and sea, terrain that neutralized Persian numerical superiority. Darius anchored his line behind the river, his Greek mercenaries in the center, cavalry massed on the coastal flank. Alexander arranged his phalanx in the center, Parmenion holding the left near the sea, and himself leading the companion cavalry on the right against the Persian left. The attack came at an oblique angle, Alexander driving his horsemen across the river and into the enemy flank with devastating speed. The Persian line buckled. In the center, a gap opened between the advancing companions and the slower phalanx, and Darius's Greek mercenaries surged into it. For a moment the battle hung in genuine doubt. But Alexander wheeled inward, driving toward the great king's position. What followed became one of antiquity's most depicted moments. Darius, seeing the Macedonian cavalry cutting toward him through his collapsing guard, turned his chariot and fled. The rout became general. Persian dead choked the riverbanks and the narrow defiles of retreat. Among the captured were Darius's mother Sysigambis, his wife Statera, and his young children, the royal family of the Achaemenid Empire, now prisoners of a 23-year-old Macedonian king. Alexander treated them with conspicuous honor. Sysigambis, according to tradition, mistook the taller Hephaestion for the king. Alexander reportedly said she had not erred, for Hephaestion too was Alexander. The gesture, whether historical or embellished, announced something new. This conqueror intended not merely to destroy Persia, but to absorb it. Darius sent envoys offering ransom and territory west of the Euphrates. Alexander refused. He would have everything, or nothing. The road to Phoenicia and Egypt lay open, and beyond them, the heartland of the empire itself. The Phoenician coast stretched before him like a chain of ancient jewels, each city a trading power unto itself, each calculating whether submission or resistance offered the better wager. Most chose submission. Byblos opened its gates. Sidon, long resentful of Tyre's dominance, welcomed the Macedonians, but Tyre, the greatest of them all, refused. The Tyrians occupied a position of extraordinary natural strength. Their city sat on an island half a mile offshore, ringed by walls rising 150 feet from the waterline, protected by a fleet that commanded the eastern Mediterranean. They offered Alexander worship at a mainland shrine, but denied him entry to the island itself. It was a polite refusal, and Alexander understood it perfectly. A free Tyre at his back meant Persian naval power intact, his supply lines vulnerable, Egypt unreachable by safe passage. He would take the city or spend himself trying. What followed was one of the most remarkable sieges in ancient military history. Beginning in January of 332 before the Common Era, Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway, a mole of stone, timber, and rubble stretching from the mainland across the channel toward the island walls. Thousands of laborers drove cedar logs into the seabed and packed debris between them, while Tyrian warships harassed the workers with arrows and fire. The Tyrians launched a devastating fireship attack that destroyed siege towers at the mole's end, and for weeks the project seemed futile. Alexander adapted. He assembled allied fleets from Sidon, Byblos, Cyprus, and Rhodes, nearly 200 warships that gradually strangled Tyrian naval superiority. The mole crept forward. Siege engines were mounted on ships lashed together, battering the island walls from the sea itself. Engineers probed for weak points along the southern fortifications. Month after month, the work continued through spring and into summer, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning pitch. In July, after 7 months, the walls finally breached. Macedonian troops poured through gaps on the southern side, while simultaneous naval assaults struck the harbors. The fighting inside was savage. The Tyrians had known what capture meant, and fought with desperate courage. When the city fell, Alexander's fury matched the siege's length. According to Arrian, 8,000 Tyrians died in the assault and its aftermath. 30,000 more, women, children, the surviving population, were sold into slavery. 2,000 military-age men were crucified along the shoreline. It was a calculated act of terror, a message to every city south along the coast. Resistance carried an absolute price. With Tyre broken, the Levantine coast submitted. Gaza alone resisted, its fortress commanding the road into Egypt, its eunuch commander Batis refusing surrender. Alexander besieged it for 2 months, was wounded twice, and when the city fell, ancient sources record that Batis was dragged alive behind a chariot, an echo, deliberate or invented, of Achilles and Hector. Egypt awaited. In late 332, Alexander crossed the Sinai and entered the Nile Delta. The Persians had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries, often harshly, and the satrap Mazaces surrendered without battle. The Egyptians received Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. At Memphis he sacrificed to Apis and was crowned pharaoh according to ancient rites, assuming titles that stretched back 3,000 years. Then came the journey that would echo through legend. Alexander marched west along the coast to the fishing village of Rakotis, where he traced the outlines of a new city, Alexandria, destined to become the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. From there he turned south into the Libyan desert, crossing 200 miles of wasteland to reach the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis. What the oracle told him remained his secret. The ancient sources agree only that he emerged claiming to have received the answer he sought. Later tradition held that the priests greeted him as son of the god. Whether Alexander believed it literally, or simply understood the political power of divine association, the visit transformed his public identity. He was no longer merely a Macedonian king. He was something older, stranger, touched by forces his own generals could not fully comprehend. The army that would march east toward Mesopotamia followed a man who now carried the weight of pharaonic divinity alongside the sarissa and the diadem. He marched east from Egypt in the spring of 331 before the Common Era, crossing the Sinai and retracing the ancient road through Palestine and Syria, gathering reinforcements as he went. The army swelled to perhaps 47,000 men, Macedonian phalanx, companion cavalry, Thessalian horsemen, Greek allied infantry, Thracian javelin throwers, Cretan archers. Every man among them understood that the war's decisive moment lay ahead. Darius III had not been idle. The defeat at Issus had cost him his family, his treasury, and his reputation, but not his empire. From the heartland of Mesopotamia, he had summoned the full strength of Achaemenid power, contingents from Bactria, Scythia, India, Persia proper, and the satrapies of Central Asia. Ancient sources place his numbers anywhere from 200,000 to 1,000,000, though modern scholarship suggests a force closer to 100,000, still vastly outnumbering Alexander's army. Darius chose his ground carefully. Near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris, on a broad plain he had ordered leveled and cleared to give his scythed chariots and cavalry room to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. Alexander crossed the Tigris in late September. On the night before battle, a lunar eclipse darkened the sky, the moon turning the color of old blood. The Macedonian seers declared it an omen favoring the attackers. Across the plain, Persian campfires stretched to the horizon. Parmenion, the old general, reportedly urged a night attack. Alexander refused. He would win in daylight, where his men could see the victory and the enemy could witness their own destruction. The morning of the 1st of October revealed the Persian line in its terrible breadth. Cavalry massed on both wings, the royal guard and Greek mercenaries at the center, war elephants and chariots arrayed before the front ranks. Alexander deployed his phalanx in the center under Parmenion's overall command of the left, while he himself took the companion cavalry on the right. His plan was deceptively simple and breathtakingly dangerous. He advanced his right wing obliquely, drawing the Persian left outward, stretching their line until a gap opened near the center. When it did, Alexander drove the companions directly at it in a wedge formation, aiming for Darius himself. The scythed chariots charged first and were neutralized. Macedonian light troops opened lanes, letting them pass through harmlessly. Then the cavalry battle erupted on both flanks with extraordinary violence. On the left, Parmenions Thessalians fought desperately against superior numbers, nearly buckling. But Alexander's strike through the gap hit the Persian center like a spear thrust into flesh. The companion cavalry smashed through, and suddenly the wedge was driving toward the great king's position. Darius, seeing the Macedonian horsemen closing on his chariot, turned and fled. As at Issus, the king's flight unraveled his army. The Persian center collapsed, and though the left wing fought on savagely, the battle was decided. The pursuit continued for miles under a rising cloud of dust. Thousands died in the rout. Darius escaped eastward into the mountains of Media, but his empire was functionally over. Alexander turned south. Babylon opened its gates without resistance, the satrap Mazaeus surrendering the greatest city in the ancient world. The conqueror entered through the Ishtar gate, walking beneath glazed brick lions and dragons, receiving the submission of priests and nobles. He sacrificed to Marduk, honoring Babylonian tradition, and ordered the restoration of temples Xerxes had damaged. The gesture was deliberate. He came not as a destroyer, but as a liberator and legitimate successor. From Babylon, the army marched to Susa, where the royal treasury yielded some 40,000 talents of gold and silver, wealth beyond anything the Greek world had imagined. Then onward to Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid dynasty, where even greater riches waited in vaults beneath the great terrace. Alexander stood in the hall of 100 columns, surrounded by the carved processions of subject nations bringing tribute to kings now dead or fugitive. The throne of the King of Kings was his. He sat upon it, and the empire that had ruled from the Aegean to the Indus for 2 centuries passed into Macedonian hands. The boy from Pella had become the master of the known world. Yet even as he sat upon that throne, something restless and unfinished burned within him. Darius still lived, somewhere to the east, gathering remnants. And Persepolis itself, that magnificent terrace of carved stone and cedar, would soon become the site of one of history's most debated acts of destruction. For several months Alexander remained in Persepolis, resting his army through the winter, consolidating control over the treasury, dispatching garrisons. Then, in the spring of 330 before the Common Era, fire consumed the great palace complex. The Apadana, the Hall of 100 Columns, the private quarters of Xerxes, all fed the flames that rose into the Persian night. Ancient sources disagree on whether this was calculated policy or drunken impulse. Arrian suggests deliberate retribution for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. Plutarch preserves the story of the Athenian courtesan Thais urging the act at a banquet. Torches passed hand to hand among revelers. What is certain is that Alexander permitted it, and that the symbolic heart of Achaemenid power was reduced to blackened columns and cracked reliefs. The charred remains still stand today, testimony to that single night. With Persepolis behind him, Alexander turned to pursuit. Darius had fled northeast toward Media, then beyond, into the vast spaces of eastern Iran. The Macedonian army moved with extraordinary speed, forced marches through summer heat, cavalry detachments riding ahead on minimal water. Near the Caspian gates, word reached Alexander that Darius was no longer fleeing of his own will. His own satraps, Bessus of Bactria and Nabarzanes, had seized the great king, binding him in golden chains in a covered wagon. Alexander drove his cavalry forward through the night. When his riders finally overtook the convoy near Hekatompilos, they found Darius already dead, stabbed by his captors, who had fled eastward. According to Plutarch, a Macedonian soldier found the dying king and brought him water. Whether Alexander himself gazed upon the body is debated, but the sources agree he ordered royal burial at Persepolis, honoring his fallen rival with the rights of a legitimate king. The gesture served both piety and politics. Alexander would claim succession, not mere conquest. Now began a transformation that would fracture the unity of his court. Alexander increasingly adopted Persian royal dress, the diadem, the striped tunic, elements of Median costume. He appointed Persian nobles to provincial commands. He expected the ceremonial obeisance that Persian subjects had offered their kings. To Macedonian veterans raised in the rough equality of Philip's war camps, these changes felt like betrayal. The king they had followed from Pella was becoming something foreign, something Eastern, something uncomfortably close to the despots they had crossed the sea to overthrow. Yet Alexander pressed deeper into the empire's eastern reaches, pursuing Bessus, who had declared himself great king under the name Artaxerxes V. The march carried the army through Hyrcania, Aria, and Drangiana, landscapes of increasing harshness, where loyalty was uncertain and supply lines stretched to breaking. In Drangiana, a conspiracy was uncovered among the king's own companions. Philotas, son of the great general Parmenion, was accused, tried before the army, and executed. Days later, Alexander sent riders to Ecbatana with orders to kill Parmenion himself, the old general who had served Philip, who had commanded the left wing at Gaugamela. The deed was done before Parmenion could learn of his son's fate. The army climbed into the Hindu Kush as winter approached, crossing passes above 10,000 feet, where snow blinded men and altitude sickened horses. They descended into Bactria in the spring of 329, entering a world of fortified oases and mounted nomads where no phalanx had ever marched. Bessus fled across the Oxus River, but Alexander followed, bridging the great river on stuffed leather skins. Bessus was betrayed by his own men, captured, and sent back in chains to face mutilation and execution in the Persian manner. Alexander stood now at the edge of the world his father's generation had known. Behind him lay burning palaces, a dead king honored in death, a trusted general murdered by Curia, and an army watching its commander become something none of them fully recognized. The conqueror was changing, and not everyone would survive the transformation. Bactria was not Persia. There were no satraps waiting with golden keys, no cities opening their gates in calculated surrender. This was a land of mud-brick fortresses perched on wind-scoured plateaus, of horsemen who struck at dawn and vanished into valleys no Greek had ever mapped. The rivers ran cold from mountain snowmelt, the summers scorched the steppe grass to amber, and the people, Sogdians, Bactrians, Scythian nomads beyond the Yaxartes, had never bent to any empire for long. Alexander had crossed the Hindu Kush and captured Bessus, but the true war was only beginning. In the summer of 329, a Sogdian lord named Spitamenes raised a general revolt. Garrisons Alexander had planted were besieged. A Macedonian relief column was ambushed and annihilated near the Polytimetus River, one of the worst defeats of the entire campaign, hushed in later accounts, but real in the bones left in that riverbed. Spitamenes fought as no Persian king had, refusing pitched battle, raiding supply lines, rallying nomadic cavalry from beyond the northern steppe. Alexander responded with a ferocity that shocked even his own officers. He divided his forces into mobile columns, burned villages that harbored rebels, and slaughtered populations that resisted. Ancient sources record the destruction of entire settlements along the Jaxartes. He founded Alexandria Eschate, the furthest, on that river's bank, a garrison city meant to stamp permanence onto a landscape that resisted it. For 2 years the war ground on, campaign season after campaign season, through terrain that swallowed armies. Alexander was wounded multiple times, an arrow to the leg, a stone to the head that left him temporarily blinded. His men suffered frostbite in mountain passes and heat stroke on summer marches within the same year. Spitamenes remained elusive until the winter of 328, when his own Scythian allies, weary of Macedonian reprisals, cut off his head and sent it to Alexander as a peace offering. Yet even with Spitamenes dead, pockets of resistance held. The most famous was the Sogdian Rock, a sheer-cliffed fortress said to be impregnable, held by the Lord Oxyates and crowded with refugees. When Alexander demanded surrender, its defenders reportedly laughed and told him to send soldiers with wings. He called for volunteers among his mountaineers, offering vast rewards to the first men to scale the cliff face. In the frozen darkness, 300 men climbed with iron tent pegs and flaxen ropes. 30 fell to their deaths on the rocks below. But by dawn, Macedonian soldiers stood on the summit above the fortress, and the defenders, believing the entire army had found a way up, surrendered without a fight. Among those within the rock was Roxana, daughter of Oxyates. The sources say Alexander saw her at a banquet following the surrender and was struck by her beauty. Whether political calculation or genuine passion drove the marriage, likely both, he wed her in the spring of 327 in the Bactrian manner, cutting bread with a sword and sharing it. It was a union that bound a conquered people to their conqueror, that gave him a foothold of legitimacy in Central Asia, and that would eventually produce his only acknowledged son. By the time Alexander turned his gaze south toward India, he had spent nearly 2 years in the hardest fighting of his life. Bactria and Sogdiana had cost him more men to guerrilla warfare than Gaugamela had cost in open battle. The campaign revealed something essential about him, an absolute refusal to leave resistance unbroken behind him, a willingness to adapt tactics to terrain, and a capacity for sustained brutality that sat alongside genuine gestures of reconciliation. He had married into the land he conquered. He had planted cities in its soil. Whether it would hold after he left was a question he did not pause to ask. The Indus waited beyond the passes, and beyond it, he believed, lay the Eastern Ocean and the very edge of the world. But the conquests revealed fractures that no victory could seal. The darkness that gathered around Alexander in these years was not the darkness of defeat. It was the darkness of a man outgrowing the world that made him, and destroying those who reminded him of what he had been. The killing of Cleitus the Black remains the most terrible single moment in Alexander's life. It happened at Maracanda in the autumn of 328 before the Common Era, during a banquet heavy with unmixed wine. Cleitus was no minor figure. He was a veteran commander of the Companion Cavalry, brother of Alexander's childhood nurse, and the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus by severing the arm that held a sword above the king's head. He was old Macedon incarnate, blunt, proud, loyal to the memory of Philip. That night, as court poets sang verses flattering Alexander above his father, Cleitus erupted. He quoted Euripides. He mocked the king's Persian pretensions. He reminded the room that Macedonian blood, not divine favor, had won these kingdoms. The sources, Plutarch drawing on Aristobulus and others, agree on what followed. Alexander seized a spear from a guard and drove it through Cleitus's body. The man who had saved him at the river crossing died on a banquet floor in Central Asia, killed by the hand he had once preserved. What followed the killing was perhaps more revealing than the act itself. Alexander collapsed into grief so violent that his companions feared he would take his own life. He refused food for 3 days. The philosopher Anaxarchus was summoned to console him, and reportedly argued that a king stood above ordinary morality, that whatever Alexander did was by definition just. It was precisely the kind of reasoning that the older Macedonian aristocracy found most dangerous, and precisely the reasoning Alexander increasingly needed to hear. The proskynesis controversy crystallized this tension into policy. Alexander attempted to introduce the Persian court ritual of bowing or prostrating before the king. For Persians, this was simple court etiquette, a gesture owed to authority. For Greeks and Macedonians, it was an act reserved for the gods alone. To perform it before a living man was to declare him divine or to declare oneself a slave. The historian Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew and the expedition's official chronicler, publicly refused. His resistance made him a hero among the Macedonian rank and file, and a marked man in Alexander's eyes. The opportunity for retribution came with the pages' conspiracy of 327. A group of royal pages, young Macedonian nobles who served as the king's personal attendants, plotted to murder Alexander in his sleep. The conspiracy was betrayed before it could be carried out. Under interrogation, some of the pages reportedly implicated Callisthenes as their intellectual inspiration. Whether he truly encouraged assassination or merely voiced the discontent that others acted upon remains unknowable. Alexander had him arrested. According to Ptolemy, Callisthenes was tortured and hanged. According to Aristobulus, he died of disease while still in chains. Either way, the message was unmistakable. Criticism of the king, even from the nephew of the man who had shaped Alexander's mind, would not be tolerated. These episodes were not isolated eruptions. They formed a pattern, the steady narrowing of the space between the king and those who had once been his equals. The old Macedonian command structure, built on a rough fellowship between king and companions, was being replaced by something closer to Oriental autocracy. Alexander filled his court with Persian nobles, dressed in Persian robes, and expected deference that Philip's veterans found alien and humiliating. The men who had crossed the Hellespont with him were aging, wounded, far from home, and increasingly uncertain whether the man they followed was still the young prince who had charged beside them at Chaeronea. The brilliance remained. The tactical mind still burned with undiminished intensity. But something essential in the bond between Alexander and his army had cracked, and the fracture lines ran deeper than any single killing or any single act of defiance. They ran through the very idea of what kind of king Alexander intended to become. India lay beyond the edge of every Greek map, a land known only through fragments. Herodotus had written of gold-digging ants, Ctesias of men with ears large enough to sleep in. But Alexander did not march toward fable. He marched toward the Indus because it was there, because no Persian king had held those provinces firmly since Darius I, and because his own restless geometry of conquest demanded that every border become a starting line. In the spring of 326 before the Common Era, the army crossed the Indus on a bridge of boats near Ohind, entering the kingdom of Taxales, whose ruler submitted without battle and offered elephants, silver, and grain. The submission was calculated. Taxales sought an ally against his rival Porus, who ruled the lands beyond the Hydaspes River. Alexander accepted the gifts, rested his men in the prosperous city of Taxila, and turned his attention eastward to the river and the king who waited on its far bank. The Hydaspes was swollen with early monsoon rains, running brown and fast between muddy banks. On the opposite shore, Porus had assembled perhaps 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, and 200 war elephants, animals the Macedonian horses had never faced in battle. The elephants were the problem. No cavalry charge could succeed against a line of maddened beasts whose smell alone would panic the horses. Alexander understood this immediately. What followed was perhaps his finest tactical operation. He feigned multiple crossing attempts over several nights, conditioning Porus to ignore alarms. Then, on a stormy night in late May, he led a strike force of roughly 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry upstream to a wooded island near Haranpa, crossing in darkness through driving rain. Thunder masked the sound of oars. By dawn he stood on the eastern bank with his best troops, 17 miles north of Porus's main position. Porus sent his son with a cavalry detachment to intercept. Alexander destroyed it. Then the king himself advanced with his full army, elephants forming a living wall across the front. Alexander refused a direct frontal assault. He sent Conus with cavalry wide around the Indian left flank, while he himself pressed the right. When Porus committed his horsemen to meet Alexander's charge, Conus struck from behind. The Indian cavalry collapsed inward, driving into their own elephants. The great beasts, wounded by javelins and maddened by pain, trampled friend and foe alike. The phalanx advanced into the chaos with locked shields. Porus fought from atop his largest elephant until wounded in the shoulder. According to Arrian, when brought before Alexander and asked how he wished to be treated, he answered with a single word, like a king. Alexander restored his kingdom and made him an ally. It was conquest through magnanimity, a pattern he preferred when the defeated earned his admiration. But the monsoon deepened. Rain fell without ceasing, rotting leather, rusting iron, breeding sickness in the camps. The army pushed east toward the Hephaestion River, and there, in the endless grey downpour of late summer, something broke. The men refused to go further. They had marched for 8 years across 20,000 miles. They were scarred, exhausted, far beyond any world they recognized. Rumors spoke of kingdoms beyond the Hephaestus fielding armies of 80,000 cavalry and thousands of elephants. Conus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, spoke for the army. Enough. Alexander raged. He sulked in his tent for 3 days, waiting for the men to relent as they had before. They did not. For the first time in his life, the world told him no, and meant it. He ordered sacrifices at the riverbank. The omens, conveniently, proved unfavorable for crossing. He erected 12 enormous altars to the 12 Olympian gods, marking the easternmost point of his march, then turned the army south toward the Hydaspes and the long journey home. The edge of the world remained unvisited. The man who had never lost a battle had finally met the one force his genius could not outflank, the exhaustion of the men who loved him. The army turned south and then west, descending the Indus through hostile country. It was no gentle withdrawal. Along the river, Alexander fought the Mali and nearly died. An arrow pierced his lung beneath the walls of their citadel, and for hours his men believed him dead. When they carried him out on a shield, pale and barely breathing, the army wept openly. The wound never fully healed. It joined the catalogue of scars that mapped his body like a record of recklessness: thigh at Granicus, shoulder at Gaza, ankle in Sogdiana, and now this, the worst, a collapsed lung that would shadow his breathing for the rest of his short life. By the summer of 325 before the Common Era, the army reached the Indus Delta and the sea. Here Alexander divided his forces with characteristic ambition. Nearchus, his Cretan admiral and childhood companion, would take the fleet westward along the coast, exploring the sea route from India to the Persian Gulf. Cleitus would march a second column through the Bolan Pass with the elephants, the siege train, and the wounded. Alexander himself chose the third path, the coastal route through Gedrosia, the modern Makran Desert of southern Pakistan and Iran. Ancient sources suggest he knew the danger. Cyrus the Great had reportedly lost an army there. Semiramis, according to legend, had crossed it with only 20 survivors. Alexander intended to succeed where they had failed. He entered the desert in late August with perhaps 40,000 soldiers and an equal number of camp followers, women, children, merchants, servants, who had trailed the army across a continent. Within days, the landscape revealed its nature. Sand stretched in every direction, featureless and burning. Water sources marked on guides' reports proved dry or brackish. The heat was absolute, rising from the ground in waves that distorted vision. Men marched at night and collapsed by day, beneath whatever shade their shields could provide. The pack animals died first, and then the weakest among the followers. Flash floods roared through dry wadis without warning, sweeping away baggage trains and drowning those who slept in riverbeds. Food ran out. Soldiers slaughtered their horses and mules for meat, then reported the animals as battle losses to avoid punishment. The army's discipline, forged across 8 years and 20,000 miles, began to dissolve into pure survival. Arrian records that Alexander walked among his men, refusing water offered to him when there was not enough for all. The famous story tells of soldiers filling a helmet with water found in a rocky cleft and bringing it to their king. He took it, looked at the parched faces around him, and poured it into the sand. The gesture, whether literally true or shaped by later admiration, captures something essential: his understanding that leadership in extremity demanded shared suffering. 60 days the crossing lasted. The losses were catastrophic. No ancient source gives a reliable figure, but modern historians estimate that tens of thousands perished, perhaps more than Alexander lost in all his battles combined. The camp followers suffered worst, unmourned by the military chronicles that recorded only soldiers. When the survivors finally staggered into the satrapy of Carmania in late autumn, they resembled refugees more than conquerors. There, in the fertile valleys east of modern Kerman, Alexander reunited with Craterus's column, which had crossed safely through the passes. And then came Nearchus, gaunt, salt-crusted, barely recognizable, reporting that the fleet had survived its own harrowing voyage along the barren coast. The reunion was emotional. Alexander had feared them all dead. What followed in Carmania was release, days of feasting, drinking, processions through garlanded streets. Some sources describe a Dionysiac revel, Alexander reclining on a high platform drawn by horses, his companions drinking for 7 days straight. The image may be exaggerated, but the relief was real. They had passed through the desert of death and emerged on the other side, diminished but alive, still moving west toward Babylon and whatever awaited them there. But the world Alexander returned to was not the one he had left. 3 years in the eastern provinces had loosened the grip of central authority, and the reports waiting for him were damning. Satraps had raised private armies. Treasurers had embezzled royal funds. generals left to govern had ruled as petty tyrants, assuming the king would never return from the edges of the earth. Alexander's response was swift and merciless. He executed or replaced officials across the empire, Macedonians and Persians alike, demonstrating that no appointment was permanent and no loyalty assumed. The purges sent a tremor through every court from Susa to Egypt. It was at Susa, in the spring of 324 before the Common Era, that Alexander staged the most dramatic expression of his vision for the empire's future. In a mass ceremony, he married 90 of his senior officers to women of Persian and Median noble families. He himself took Statera, daughter of the dead Darius, and Parysatis, daughter of the previous king Artaxerxes III. Hephaestion married Statera's sister Drypetis, binding himself to Alexander through shared royal blood. The weddings lasted 5 days. Persian rites were observed. The banquet hall was draped in purple and white linen, golden couches arranged in concentric rows, 10,000 guests feasting beneath a canopy supported by gilded columns. It was spectacle as policy, the deliberate fusion of Macedonian and Persian aristocracies into a single ruling class. Yet the Macedonian veterans saw it differently. When Alexander announced that 30,000 Persian youths had been trained in Macedonian weapons and drill, the so-called successors, the old soldiers felt themselves being replaced. At Opis, on the Tigris, the resentment broke into open mutiny. Veterans shouted that he should campaign with his father Ammon, mocking his divine claims. Alexander leaped from the platform, personally seized 13 ringleaders, and ordered their immediate execution. Then he withdrew to the palace and refused all contact for 2 days, appointing Persians to Macedonian command positions. The bluff worked. The army broke, weeping outside his doors, begging reconciliation. Alexander emerged and embraced them. A great banquet of 9,000 followed, Macedonians and Persians drinking from the same bowls, while Alexander prayed for harmony and partnership in rule. Then came the blow from which he never recovered. In the autumn of 324, at Ecbatana, Hephaestion fell ill with fever. For 7 days his condition worsened. Alexander, attending games in the stadium, received word that the crisis had deepened and rushed to his side, but arrived too late. Hephaestion was dead. The sources agree on the scale of Alexander's grief, even if they differ on its expression. He lay across the body for a day and a night. He ordered the sacred fire in every temple extinguished, an honor reserved for the death of a great king. He had Hephaestion's physician crucified. He commanded a funeral pyre in Babylon of staggering expense, its tiers decorated with golden eagles, ships' prows, and sculpted lions, rising 200 feet into the Mesopotamian sky. He sought and received divine honors for Hephaestion as a hero. The grief was not performance. Something essential in Alexander had broken. The final months unfolded in Babylon beneath a gathering weight of omens. Chaldean priests warned him not to enter the city from the west. Seers reported troubling signs. A stranger found sitting silently on the royal throne, sacrificial animals yielding malformed organs. Alexander planned obsessively for the next campaign, the conquest of Arabia, the circumnavigation of the peninsula, the exploration of the Caspian. Fleets were being assembled. Harbors dredged. Embassies arrived from across the Mediterranean, from Carthage, from Italian peoples, perhaps from Rome, though this last claim remains disputed. the scale of his ambitions had not diminished. If anything, the loss of Hephaestion had driven him deeper into the only language he still understood: forward motion, conquest, the next horizon. But his body, scarred by a dozen serious wounds, weakened by years of campaigning and increasingly heavy drinking, was failing. The man who had crossed the Hindu Kush and survived the Gedrosian desert was 32 years old and already ancient in the currency of war. In late May of 323 before the Common Era, Alexander attended a banquet at the house of Medius of Larissa, one of his companions. He drank heavily, the sources agree on this, and was seized by a sudden fever. What followed was documented in the royal diaries, fragments of which survive through Plutarch and Arrian. Over the next 10 to 11 days, the fever did not break. He continued to issue orders, to plan the Arabian expedition, to sacrifice to the gods each morning as attendants carried him to the altars. But his strength drained steadily, like water from a cracked vessel. By the final days, he could no longer speak. His soldiers, hearing rumors that their king was already dead, forced their way into the palace, the ancient palace of Nebuchadnezzar, where Alexander had made his court. They filed past his bed one by one, thousands of them, and he acknowledged each with a movement of his eyes, a slight lift of his hand. It was the last communion between the conqueror and the men who had followed him from Macedon to the Indus and back. On the 10th or 11th of June, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. When asked to whom he left his empire, later tradition claims he whispered a single word: to the strongest. Whether he truly said it, or whether the silence that followed his death simply invited the answer, the result was the same. There was no viable heir. Roxana was pregnant but had not yet delivered. His half-brother Aridaeus was mentally impaired. The empire, held together by one man's will, began to fracture before the body was cold. The generals, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Seleucus, Lysimachus, became the Diadochi, the successors, and they fought for 40 years over the carcass of Alexander's conquests. The wars that followed were as vast and bloody as the campaigns that built the empire. Kingdoms crystallized: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedon. The Hellenistic world that emerged was Alexander's true monument. Greek language, art, philosophy, and science spread across a territory stretching from Sicily to Afghanistan. His body became a prize. Perdiccas intended it for Macedon, but Ptolemy intercepted the funeral cortege in Syria and diverted it to Egypt. Eventually it rested in a golden sarcophagus in Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, where it was visited by Julius Caesar, Augustus, and countless pilgrims for centuries. The tomb vanished sometime after the 4th century of the Common Era. It has never been found. But the legend only grew. The Alexander Romance, composed in the centuries after his death and translated into over 80 languages, transformed the historical king into a figure of myth, a seeker of immortality, a visitor to the bottom of the sea and the gates of paradise. Persians remembered him as Iskandar, sometimes cursed as a destroyer, sometimes honored as a just king. Medieval Christians claimed him as a champion of God. The Islamic tradition placed him as Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, builder of walls against chaos. Beneath the legend, archaeology, and the surviving source fragments, Ptolemy's memoir filtered through Arrian, Aristobulus's more cautious account, Nearchus's voyage log, allow us to glimpse the man. A reader of Homer who slept with the Iliad beneath his pillow. A tactical genius who never lost a pitched battle. A leader who shared every hardship with his men and bore the scars to prove it. A man capable of extraordinary generosity and terrifying rage. A visionary who imagined a world fused from Greek and Persian traditions, and a tyrant who demanded worship from free men. He reshaped the ancient world in 13 years. The dust of his passage settled into the foundations of civilizations that endured for centuries. And the question that his life poses, what happens when limitless ambition meets a mortal body, remains as vivid now as it was on that June evening in Babylon, when the greatest conqueror the ancient world had known drew his last breath in a borrowed palace, aged 32, with the whole earth still not enough. Thank you for joining this journey through the life of Alexander. If these stories brought the ancient world closer, consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next.